These everyday American foods contain additives banned or heavily regulated in Europe. And chances are you've already eaten them. Artificial dyes, preservatives, sweeteners, emulsifiers. Additives that have been linked to cancer, cardiovascular disease, reproductive harm, immune disruption, or effects on brain development in children. Why is the US lagging behind when it comes to food safety regulations? And most importantly, what can we as consumers actually do about it? On average, processed foods in the US contain 3.1 additives per product. That's nearly double the amount found in countries like Italy, which averages at only 1.6 additives per product. France and Germany average at 1.9 additives per product, Canada at 2.5, Spain at 2.6, and the UK averages at 2.9 additives per product. For instance, let's look at store-bought bread. In the US, it contains an average of 6.2 additives per product. That's 40% higher than the global average for this category when compared to many other countries, which is 4.4 additives per product. And it's not just about the number of additives. The real concern is their potential impact on our health. Several of these additives are banned in the European Union because of documented risks to human health. Take titanium dioxide, a whitening agent used in candies and baked goods. It has been banned in Europe since 2022 due to concerns over potential carcinogenic and genotoxic effects. Yet, in the United States, it remains legal and widely used. Around a dozen very controversial additives that are still commonly used in the US have been banned in Europe, like propylparaben or smoke flavor. And that's only part of the problem. In the US, authorized additives can be used far more freely than in other countries. Aluminum sodium sulfate is a clear example of this regulatory gap. This additive contains aluminum, a substance suspected of impacting reproductive health, fetal development, and contributing to disease like Alzheimer's. While it's allowed in both Europe and the US, it's heavily restricted in Europe, where it can only be used in candied cherries and liquid egg whites. The US permits it in all types of food, and it's found everywhere, leading to significantly higher exposure for American consumers. Additive dosages in the US are also largely unregulated, with very few limits in place. Among the 50 most risky and commonly used additives, 38% have no restrictions on the amount that can be used. In comparison, only 14% of additives in Europe have no restrictions on dosage. Blue One, for example, is a synthetic food dye linked to hyperactivity and attentional disorders in children and suspected of causing toxicity to the immune system and blood. In Europe, its use is limited to a small number of products with strict maximum levels, especially in items frequently consumed by children like ice cream and candy. In the US, however, Blue One is allowed in all products with no defined upper limit. A 2015 study revealed extremely high levels in cupcakes, candies, and even breakfast cereals, with products containing nearly 3 times more Blue One than what's permitted in Europe. While US officials have recently announced plans to ban the dye, no regulatory action has yet materialized. And even when regulatory limits are in place, they are often far more lenient in the US. Sodium nitrates, which are widely used in daily meats and classified as probably carcinogenic, are allowed at levels up to 4 times higher than the maximum permitted in the European Union. But how can such a stark disparity be explained? This regulatory gap stems from 2 fundamentally different approaches to food safety. When assessing additives, the European Union applies the precautionary principle, meaning it bans or restricts additives as soon as there is scientific doubt about their safety. The United States, on the other hand, takes a reactive approach, assuming that additives are safe until proven otherwise. As a result, a ban only occurs when there is definite proof of harm, which can take decades. European law also requires the reassessment of all food additives authorized before 2009, and about 70% of them have already been reviewed. In the US, many additives approved decades ago remain on the market without any updated evaluation in light of new scientific research. Reassessments typically occur only when public interest groups advocate for them. Take yellow 5. This artificial dye was approved in 1969 based on one singular study. At that time, no assessment of neurobehavioral effects were included. Yet today, concerns about yellow 5's impact on the brain, particularly in children, are among the primary reasons it's under scrutiny. Since this approval date, 20 independent and very solid studies have linked this dye to hyperactivity, allergies, chronic diseases, and reduced fertility. 2 recent reviews have even concluded that the safety threshold for yellow 5 is set too high. However, the FDA has never reevaluated this additive in light of all this new evidence. The FDA also demonstrates notably less transparency and scientific rigor compared to its European counterpart. To date, it has published only 15 documents detailing its approach to assessing food additives, compared to 370 publications from the European Food Safety Authority, which provides far more comprehensive and accessible insight into its evaluation process. To assess the robustness of sources, the EFSA in Europe also uses strict criteria to select studies, including a scoring system that prioritizes reliability. For instance, studies that overlook major risk factors like alcohol or tobacco are excluded to avoid bias. By contrast, the FDA has no clear method for study selection, only a non-binding guide with vague recommendations. This gap in risk standards also extends to contaminants hidden within additives. Europe applies strict limits on the presence of contaminants in additives, particularly toxic heavy metals such as arsenic, lead, mercury, and cadmium. In the United States, while some specifications exist, they apply to only a minority of additives and are generally more lenient. For example, the lead limit for sucrose esters of fatty acids, a common emulsifiers, is 5 times higher than in Europe. And there is no limit set for other heavy metals such as cadmium or mercury. One critical issue with the approval of additive is the food industry's overarching influence. Over time, this corporate pressure has weakened the FDA's ability to properly regulate new additives. This is largely due to the GRAS process, which stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. Back in 1958, the GRAS status was created for well-known ingredients whose safety was well established, like salt, pepper, or vinegar. These ingredients were exempt from FDA approval because their safety was considered obvious. For all other ingredients, companies had to submit a file to the FDA with scientific data proving their safety. The FDA would then carry out a detailed review before making a decision, a process that could take several years. In 1997, under pressure from the food industry to speed up approval times, the FDA changed the GRAS process. Under the new system, manufacturers could declare a substance as GRAS on their own, simply by notifying the FDA. Instead of conducting a full evaluation, the FDA would only review the company's submission and issue a non-binding opinion. The situation worsened in 2016, when notifying the FDA about GRAS substances became completely optional. Manufacturers can now introduce new GRAS ingredients to the market without even informing the agency. In other words, companies are allowed to decide for themselves whether their additives are safe, with no strict or independent oversight. Since the year 2000, nearly 99% of new food additives have been approved by companies themselves under GRAS status. And it doesn't stop there. US expert panels hired by companies are also highly questionable. These panels are strikingly small, averaging just 3.5 members. In contrast, European panels typically include at least 11 experts and sometimes up to 21 experts. Beyond their limited size, US panels raise serious concerns about independence. A 2023 study revealed that the same 7 experts appeared in more than half of the panels and frequently worked together. Rather than forming independent groups for each evaluation, as the FDA recommends, the same experts are often used, and many of them work for consulting firms funded by the food industry. Aspartame is a clear example of how conflicts of interest can influence public health decisions. In 1975, the FDA initially rejected aspartame due to concerns about its link to cancer. But a few years later, under President Reagan, a new FDA commissioner with ties to Searle, the company that developed aspartame, was appointed. Shortly after, in 1981, the FDA approved its use. This decision was based on a flawed, unpublished two-page cancer study funded by Ajinomoto, one of the largest producers of aspartame. What's even more troubling is that 6 FDA officials involved in the approval later took jobs at companies linked to the sweetener. Unfortunately, this is a clear example of the revolving door between industry and regulators. Despite significant shortcomings in the US food regulatory system, there are encouraging signs of progress and growing evidence that consumer action can drive real change. This is exactly what has happened in Europe over the past decade. Thanks to tools like UCA and the Nutri-Score labeling system, consumers have become more aware of how food impacts their health and are now making more informed choices. For example, many have changed their purchasing habits. In fact, 95% of UCA users report having stopped buying products with controversial additives, which is a powerful demonstration of how access to information can shift consumer behavior. And UCA's impact in Europe was both swift and significant. Only a few years after we launched the app in 2017, dozens of food companies began reformulating their products to improve nutritional quality and eliminate controversial additives. For example, Intermarché, a major French supermarket chain, reformulated 900 products by removing 142 additives. As a result, the European food market has undergone a major shift in the past few years. In France, for example, the average number of risky additives in processed foods has decreased by 15% between 2019 and 2025. In some product categories, the progress is even more striking. Biscuits, for instance, have seen a 30% reduction in high-risk additives, and breakfast cereals a 60% reduction. Consumers have undeniably taken back power, and today at UCA we are convinced that together we represent a force strong enough to demand healthier, safer food from manufacturers. We firmly believe that what happened in Europe can and should happen here in the United States. The good news is that it's starting to pay off. We are seeing more and more product reformulation in the US with the removal of harmful additives. For example, Skittles has eliminated titanium dioxide. Chobani has started removing phosphates from some of its products. And Members Mark, the Sam's Club brand, plans to remove 40 controversial ingredients by the end of the year. To accelerate this shift, we recently launched a new feature in the app that allows users to directly call out brands using risky additives, either by email or publicly on social media. And it's already making waves. Over 1 million messages have been sent so far. US brands can no longer ignore this growing demand for transparency, accountability, and better ingredients. The message is clear. When consumers are informed, they take action. And when they act together, change becomes unstoppable.